So those are going to be some of the logistic stuff that we'll cover in the very beginning. In the meantime, that first link that's provided is the pre-workshop exercise. So this is sort of a way to get everyone up to speed to go through that example. And so I'll review that, and then we'll treat that as sort of like the prerequisite knowledge for the rest of the class. So we'll take a couple of minutes for people to work through that, and I'll set a little timer, and then we can start today's class, as soon as everyone is signed in and went through the pre-workshop exercise, or as a sort of like a small review. There is no actual right or wrong answer to all of this, so don't worry about it. And the general plan is there's going to be a pre-workshop exercise. There's going to be the actual workshop. There's going to be 3 exercises in between the workshop, and then a post-workshop exercise. So that's the general flow that we have. couple more seconds before we start. I think everyone who wants to be here is already here. So, uh, again, so we'll start with the workshop portion. So, welcome everyone to today's class. We are going to be talking about tidy data principles for today for the rest of the 1.5 hour block. So, tidy data principles are essentially when the first important concept when you're thinking about cleaning data or when you're curating and putting together data yourself, you want to have a good idea about how your data wants to get processed later on for the computer to do some kind of analysis. So, in today, we'll talk about data sets that are good for you as the person putting things together, and then data sets that are good for a computer to do the analysis or calculation. And this is really another term that you would hear is data wrangling, and so hence it's got a cowboy metaphor to it. I just read a paper that someone there might be a new term. I really hope it doesn't go on. It's called a data move, like you're moving data, like but data wrangling, data cleaning has been the terms that's been around since the early 2010s. Um, and so today's class, we are really going to do a small lit review or a journal club of the 2014 Tidy Data paper by Hadley Wickham. I will today at the end of this class, I'll give you links to everything so you don't have to worry too much about finding these resources. The original 2014 paper, the definition for tidy data has sort of evolved to it's a little bit different from if you look it up today, but we'll walk through this paper. Most of the concepts from the paper are exactly the same, but I like using this paper because it's something that you can point to as an academic paper. People sometimes put more emphasis on that, and so that's why we're working through the paper. It's still very relevant because in this paper, um, this is a mock data set from the tidy data paper. And the question here is this a clean data set? Well, that's really ambiguous. We don't really have a good concept of what is a row and what is a column. And so here in each row, we have a person, and each column, we have treatment A and treatment B, and some value between the two treatments. And if you're putting together data by yourself, this is reasonable. You can very spot check to see, oh, like it looks like treatment B, the values are going down. Or am I do I have all the values I need for each treatment? Did I forget to make a recording or something? But this is really good for you as a person putting together data. If we transpose this data set, like literally swap the rows and columns together, we get this view of this data, which is more or less the same thing. So for each row, we now get a treatment value, and then each column, we now have a person. And so we can do the same visual check, right? We can say, am I missing any values in treatment A? And I can look across. I can look up and down to see if there's general differences. It does get a little bit harder if we want to ask the question like, what is the average value of treatment A and treatment B and make that calculation? If you're thinking in the world of Excel, yes, you can make a new column that takes the average across all of the values of the row. That's something you can do. Um, you can also imagine in this form of the data set, if I have 200 people, I'm now going to end up creating column number 201. Sometimes that gets a little bit unwieldy. Um, and so that's sort of when you end up in that kind of scenario, this is sort of where tidy data principles are. The tidy data paper actually says that those two examples I just showed you is not quote unquote tidy or clean for the computer. It's this version of the data set. And this, at first glance, is a little bit harder to do those visual checks for you as a person, right? Like it's harder for me to see what are the differences between values for Jane Doe. Like I have to look between multiple lines and I can't just quickly look across or up. Um, but now the benefit of this is I can use the computer to do a lot of the work because now each row is an individual observation and each column is a separate variable. And variables are things I can make calculations on. So I can very easily say like, give me the average of the result column and I can get the average treatment value for the result column. Or maybe I want to say I want the average result for each unique value of treatment, like a group by operation in the Excel world. And I can say group by treatment, give me the average result. And so that's what makes this form of the data set tidy. It's because I can tell the computer to perform operations by pointing at individual columns. And that goes true for if I'm trying to plot variables. I want, bar graphs based off of treatment and then the average result as the height of the bar, right? Or if I'm trying to fit a model, I want to predict the value of results given the value of treatment. I can point to those columns, and that is one of those heuristics that if I want to do an operation, if I can point to one column for that, then that's what makes a tidy data. And so, what is the definition of tidy? The newer form of the definition has these three components. Each variable forms a column, each observation forms a row, and in each cell is a single measurement. And we'll see what happens. And part of the exercises and examples we're going through are going to see what happens when each one of those rules are broken and how we can deal with it. And so the benefit of tidy data stuff is we can use literally like fundamentally the three functions that I'm going to cover pretty much will cover a lot of use cases to untidy or clean up a bunch of data sets. So we can use very simple fundamental tools to process almost every type of messy data. And then that feeds into model fitting or um, visualizations or any type of summary statistic that you would want. And so that is the whole point, is to have a data set that once you get it into tidy form, you've processed a bunch of really common data problems, and then you can pivot it to whatever format that you want for whatever need that you're looking at. And so we will go through the three most common data problems in today's. So all tidy data sets look the same. Each messy data set is different in their own way, and we can use fundamental tools to turn messy data sets into tidy. All right, so we talked about different types of problems. What is the first common data problem that we'll have? The actual name is called column headers are values, not variable. That's the more formal title of it. But this is data from the Pew Research Center. It is for any given religion that you can see on the left-hand side, the religion column. There are income brackets, and then the body of the data set is the count of the. And so if I were to give you this data set, it is very space efficient. I can fit a lot of value, a lot of variables into this data set. But one of those problems that I will have is I don't really have an easy way to say, um, give me the total number of participants by religion and income bracket, right? I don't have individual columns I can point to. If you ever end up in a situation where you're very proficient in Excel, but something's a little bit awkward, that's sort of another um, like data smell, if you will, about something's a little bit weird. I don't have the ability to say like, I want total number as the height of a bar and I want income as a variable, right? And it's because our columns are not actual variables, they're actual values. So if we want to think about what is a tidy data or a clean form of this data set, I would typically say take out a piece of paper, roughly sketch out this part of the data set, and then think about what you want as a tidy form. So remember, each column should be a variable. So we want a variable called religion, a variable called income, and then another variable called. So if we want the tidy form, it'll look something like this. We have variables called religion, income, and frequency. And then you can see each row is now an observation. Again, this isn't a very space efficient because you can see there's very little amounts of data presented on a screen compared to the previous version. But we can now say, I want all of the like total number of people by religion. So I can say group by religion, give me the sum of the frequency, or group by income, give me sum of frequency, something like that. And so this notion that is going from these two forms of the data set, that is one of the core fundamental components of tidy data. And once you understand or you can see how data can be pivoted from one form to the other, you'll have a lot more flexibility when you're putting together data sets and when you are need your analysis performed on that data set. So at the very beginning, I talked about in the chat, there is a link to the zip file. So hopefully you have that unzipped and you can open up the project. So for me, it's going to be called learner. It's going to be called ds4biomed-learner. And then you can open up the actual studio project and we'll open up, um, our studio will open up into that folder. I realize I should not have. So I'm going to create a new script at the very top. I will call this tidy.r, just so I have the contents there. And let's go through and see what the code looks like to process that type of data or that very first data problem. So I'm going to load up the tidyverse library. And the first data set that we're going to look at is going to be the tumor data set. We can read in the CSV. And that tumor data set we're going to look at is going to be in the data folder. And it's going to be called tumor growth underscore log. This is an actual data set that I've modified from the medical data R package. And if we look at this data set, it is for some treatment group. So we have control and drug and what some kind of medication. We have a column called ID for the person in the study. And then you can see here, we have 0 all the way up to 28. That is days into the study. So this is looking at different people into this research study. We take some baseline type of tumor measurement, and then we see what the tumor size is according to different days in the study and see if there's a difference between treatment groups. And again, this might be useful because if you're the person putting together data, you can look at the person and then look across to make sure that you're not missing any data. Are you missing an observation? It's really useful for you as a person, but not useful for you for a computer per se. So let's get this into tidy data format. So like I said, think about if you ever look at the columns and you see like, hey, there's a pattern that's going on with these columns, right? So for me, it looks like it's 0 to 28. That pattern is saying that, hey, that actually represents day of the month. So I really should have a column called day. And then the values here is a value. So I should have another column called value. And just because this format of the data is useful for some part of your data processing step, when we talk about tidy data, this is also the data format you want to save when you give it to someone else. So they can do whatever they want, and then they know that a lot of these common data problems have been dealt with. So this is the tumor data set. So how do we go about performing that pivoting operation? So the way we do that is we can take the tumor data set, we can pipe it into a function called pivot underscore longer, right? So going from wide, which is a lot of columns, to long, which is a fewer number of columns, but more rows. The first parameter after we pipe in is we need to select the columns that we want to pivot. So what are the columns we want to pivot? We want to start from the column that says 0 all the way to the column that's 28, or really the last column. So in R, if we want to select the column, we put in the column name. But because this column starts with a 0, we actually have to wrap it around backticks. So that is the key to the left of the number 1 on a QWERTY keyboard, and I believe it's 6 or 8 if you're on a European keyboard. It is a little bit different from a single. And so that's how we specify the first column, or that column called 0. And then the easy way of going to the last column is we can use this colon to say, I want to select all of the columns up until the last column. So we can put in last call, right? You could put in here backtick 28. That's totally fine. The reason why I'm saying or suggesting you use last call is because there is a chance that you are adding more days to the study. And if you hard code a 28, you might forget to update your data, right? And that's something that happened sort of in the UK when they were trying to keep track of COVID data and they were appending things to the columns, and essentially Excel ran out of columns. Things like that, when you're appending data, new data in columns, you have to be very mindful of that. And one of the ramifications is also use something like last call. So if we run this, you'll see that we have roughly the data set that we want. It became from wide to long, so this pivot longer is that function call. But let's go and clean up some of this data because we don't want it to be called name and value. We want this to be called day and size. So the next parameters that we can put into pivot longer is names underscore 2 is going to be day. So we get a new column called day. And then we can have another parameter called values underscore 2, and we can call that size. Now if we run this, we get the same data set, but we have day and size as our new column names. And just for this part of the study, what I like to do sometimes is I also, there is a way to, if a row has a missing value, you can drop the row. And so all of the missing values can be dropped if we pipe that into a function called drop. And then we can say tumor underscore tidy, tumor underscore tidy gets that tidy data set. Right? So the key point here is we can use pivot longer to make that tidy data. All right. Okay. So what I want everyone to do now is we'll take our first exercise. So everyone, we can go to the Google Sheet here, and there is a column called EX1. And so we'll take 5 minutes for everyone to work through that very first exercise. So the link is going to be posted in the Google chat. Try not to click the wrong one. It's okay if you do. I'll end up just dropping this stuff out of the data set. You can enter your ID. It's the same ID as before. Open the exercise URL in a web browser. Don't go ahead, even though it's really tempting. And then when you're done, copy paste it into the code text slot in the survey when you're done. So we'll take about 5 minutes to work through that set of examples. Um, believe if you're still working on it, please let me know in some way, shape, or form. Everyone is done with that exercise already. So let's very quickly go over it. So the prompt asks you for, here's an example of the Ebola data set from the 2014 Ebola outbreak. And I want you to tidy the data set so it looks something like this. So you can see here we have a column called day and a column called cases. And the difference, or the thing I want you to realize, that if we look at the columns here, they look like it looks like it followed some kind of pattern. That pattern is going to be days into the outbreak, instead of like, so this outbreak data has 289 days. That's how long the Ebola outbreak occurred. And so what I want you to recognize is that this should be a pivot longer operation. So we can say Ebola, it goes into a function called pivot underscore longer, font a little bigger, pivot underscore longer. And then in here, the key was recognizing that we want to put in 289 as the first column, last col as the last one, and then names underscore 2 is going to be day, and then values underscore 2 is going to be called cases. And then for this exercise, we're also saying to drop the missing value. So if we run that, we get a data set that is exactly the same as the target data set that we were working. So that is one of the first concepts of tidy data, which is recognizing when you need to perform this pivoting operation. And it's really, really important. Um, this is a really important concept. It's also a very powerful concept. And not every single data set will be that obvious, that you need to do one of these operations. So another form or another common data problem, this is the second one mentioned in Hadley Wickham's data paper, is multiple variables stored in one column. So here I have presented, this is the World Health Organization tuberculosis counts in the year 2000. And we have country, year, and then we have all of these other columns. So the first thing, even if I didn't tell you what these columns meant, it should trigger that, I think I need to pivot longer something. Why? Because these column names look like they're part of a single pattern, or they should be part of the same thing. And so here, if I look at this 183, it actually, now that I'll tell you what this column means, it stands for males aged 25 to 34. So this 183 represents two things. But that also breaks that other rule in tidy data where each cell should only measure one thing. This 183, it is tied together with gender and age group. And so we have male 0 to 14 to males unknown, and female 0 to 14 all the way to female unknown. We have all of those sets of data, all of those columns. And we now have a problem because this 183, it's a little bit harder to say, like, well, in this country AM, how many males do I have? Right? I don't have the ability to say, you know, sum up where the values are male. I have to do this weird, like, partial summing of a subset of the rows, right? I don't have a single column I can point to help me make this calculation. Same thing. I don't have the ability to say, like, oh, how many tuberculosis counts was there in the year 2000 for all people age 15 to 24, regardless of gender, right? I don't have the ability to easily do that. So before we get too far, let's fix the problem that we first identified, which is, hey, these columns look like there's a pattern. And think about that piece of paper you're going to end up drawing. I want a column, or I want a data set that says country, year, sex, age group, and count. There's a little problem because sex and age group is put together, but let's fix the problems one step at a time. The first thing I noticed is, hey, this might be a pivot longer operation. And so let's go and do that first. If we do that, we have the data set on the left-hand side here. which is great. It's a little bit closer, right? We have country, year, cases. That's good. And then we have this other column called column. Um, and then what we wanted at the end was this column on this data set on the right, which is um, we have a separate column for we have a separate column for sex and age group. And if I were to ask you, how do I, without even knowing anything about programming, if my prompt to you was, how do we go from that version on the left to that version on the right, like minus like the whole prettiness of the dashes and the plus, how would I do that? Well, one thing that you can do is, hey, if I just pull out the first letter of this column, I can turn that into the sex column, and then everything else becomes the age group column. That's one heuristic you can do. Another heuristic you can do is, hey, anything that's not a number, so all the letter stuff becomes sex, and then all of the numbers become the age group. That might work as well. The only problem is you have a value called male unknown, which is designated as MU, and that becomes a problem because now we don't have the age group. So think about heuristics, like what is more generalizable. There's multiple ways you can deal with it, but for now we can say, hey, if I just pop out the first column or the first value, that'll be the sex column, right? And so that's a hint for you when you're putting together data sets that you can leave yourself breadcrumbs to process your data set further, right? So maybe instead of M as the first letter, I can say M underscore 014. And I can say, oh, if I just split on the underscore or split on a dash, I can break up my components together, right? And that's useful sometimes too when you're working with dates, right? You can have dashes in year, month, and day, and then you have a process to break up the year value, the month value, and the day value later on if you need. So let's look at what this code looks like in the R world. So we can, in the same data set, we can load up another data set called TB. We're going to read underscore CSV. We're going to read a different data set this time. It's going to be under data, and it's going to be called TB underscore long. And now, if I look at, whoops, if I look at this data set, this is exactly the same data set that I just showed you from the tidy data paper. So we have country, year, and we have male 0 to 14, the male's unknown, and then the whole same set of values for for the female. And so let's go through that process. Very similar to the previous example, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to run a pivot longer step, right? So I'm going to say TB is going to go into a value called pivot underscore longer. And what are the columns that I want to select? So if we go back here, it's going to be M014 all the way to the last column. So let's go and do that. I'm going to say M014 colon last underscore column, right? And in this case, I don't have to put it in backticks, although you can if you want, because my variable begins with a letter. So a lot of programming languages don't like it when you start a variable with a number because I think it's a number. Especially if it's a variable that starts with the letter 0. You might think it's something. All right, so we have this, and that's part of the way there, right? Um, that is that version of that data set on the left-hand side that I showed you. And so what was the next part is, oh, well, the heuristic is if I pop out the first letter or some kind of delimiter or separator, some kind of thing, I can make 2 new columns based off of that type of pattern. So let's go and do that. There is an actual function called separate. And when we pipe this data set here into separate, The first parameter we want to specify is the column we want to break up. So in our case right now, we have a column called name. I'm going to pass it the column called name. There's another parameter called into. So when this gets broken up into multiple columns, what are going to be the new column name? I'm going to wrap, because it's going to be more than one column, so it's going to be sex and age group, I have to wrap it around this C function, which if you're not new to R, you know what the C function does. If you're new to R, think of it as creating a list of objects, right? So I'm going to create multiple column names, and I need to put it into a single container, and we use the C function for that. We're going to create two new columns called sex and age underscore group. And then the last parameter, so after into and after this closing round bracket, there's a parameter called sep. And if we give it a number, that's how it will know how many characters in will it make the break. And so here, if it was like an underscore or a dash, or, sometimes things are separated by semicolon. If you're working with tags, you can change that here. So instead of 1, you might put in like semicolon or something. If we run this, you can see here, we now have a data set that's country, year, sex, age group, and value. And so that separator function is how we can use the separate function on a tidier data set, because we can now point to a single column and say, hey, I want to make a transformation to this one entire column, right? And that's a lot easier to work with than, breaking up all of the gender components from males unknown, all males 0 to 14 to female unknown. A lot more typing to manually break that up. Here, I just say, hey, point to this one column, and that's how I want you to. And in here, because we have all of these missing values, we can then pipe this into drop underscore NA as a very crude way of dropping missing values. And then we can save this into a data set called db underscore tidy to get our tidy data set. And now we have the ability to say like, oh, group by sex, give me the total sum of value, right? Or group by age group, give me the sum of values. And it's much easier to do that calculation than sort of saying like, if you think about it on how you would do this in the Excel world, which would be like, you'll make another calculation, you'll say equal sum, and then you'll drag like a bunch of columns or cells. That's really error prone in the sense that like you might, if you're adding more data, you might forget to like move things off. So like much easier in a tidier form. So even in Excel, you can now in this format say group by sex, give me sum of value, right? So you don't have to worry about doing that cell selection for your formula. Right. So that's the main takeaway here is get your data set, identify the first set of mistakes, and then think about what the next step would be in your data processing step. Right. So we will take another 5-minute block of time. So in there, you can go back to the spreadsheet that I just linked to, and then we'll take some time to work on the value that's under exercise 2. Set a timer for 5 minutes. And again, just it's the same set of rules as before. Paste it in the link to the chat and try not to click the wrong link. Enter your ID, open up the exercise URL, copy paste the code. Do not copy paste the actual URL. That I can't see any of that. And then don't forget to submit the survey, and then don't move on to the next exercise. Then we'll take a couple of minutes, and then I will go over that solution. All right, let's go over this example. This example was on exercise 2. It is a different form or a different view of that data set. And so um, it's a little bit different from the version we saw in exercise 1. And if I can make this a little bit bigger, um, this view of the data set, we have cases Guinea, cases Liberia. And if we look a little bit to the right, we'll see that we'll have columns that's deaths followed by country. Right, so that's going to be, this is actually how the Ebola data set is stored in the actual raw data form. And so this 8,157 represents a count of two things. It is counting whether or not this is a case count or death count, and then the country, right? So it's a very similar problem from what I just showed, but even if you don't automatically recognize that, hopefully you do see that a lot of these columns fit into a pattern, right? So that's something that we want to deal with. We want a special data set down here that says date, day, case, death, country, and value. And so this way we can then say, hey, for each day of the outbreak, what are the total case counts? So we have the ability to say group by day, group by case death, give me the sum of the value, or some kind of um, we can think in terms of columns instead of like selecting subsets of our data, right? So that's one of those heuristics that you want to think about um, when you are working with processing and cleaning data. So the way this solution looks is we can take our Ebola data set, we pass it into pivot underscore longer, and then in here, we are going to uh, pass in the columns, which is going to be, what are the columns? Cases underscore Guinea all the way to the end. So I'm going to say last underscore call just because that's a little bit easier. And then the separator. So before I showed you the separator was a number. In our case, the separator between those two components is going to be the underscore. And then I can pass this into a function called drop underscore NA. And if we look at this, we're almost there. Oh, whoops. Sorry. I messed that up. So pivot longer that is the first part of our data set. So then now the heuristic is how do we break this component up? So if I were to say, hey, this looks like this underscore is really strategic, I can put that into a function called separate. The column I'm going to separate is going to be column called name. And then I'm going to break this into two new columns called case underscore death and then country. And then the actual separator is going to be the underscore. And now if I run that and I type things properly, I get the data set for the actual solution that we were. That means that we can do something like, oh, what are the total number of uh, cases for each country? Well, I can filter on values where it's a case, and then group by country, give me the sum of the value. I can do stuff like that. If I'm plotting, it's easier to draw a line graph now because I have date and value, and I can do some of the calculations like that. Right. The last exercise, or the last really common data problem, is this, where we have variables are stored in both rows and columns. And this one's actually more difficult to see. Sometimes you don't even think that this is a problem, and it's okay. But you try to process your data in think of like the more obvious things that show up as a problem, and then you fix problems one step at a time, right? You don't have to completely clean a data set perfectly on the first go. Chances are you're going to need to clean your data set for a particular calculation. So work in steps. So this is an example data set. It is weather data set for a given location and year. I believe it's only the year 2000. Month of the year. It's going to give us whether or not this is a maximum reading or a minimum reading, and then days of the month, and then the actual temperature value. And so right now, before you even realize that there's more going on in this data set, you should be able to see that if I take a look at these columns, it looks like there's a pattern. And so that should trigger for the fourth time today, this should be a pivot longer call somewhere. And so if I want to think of this data set, I want a column that's like ID, all of the date components, so year, month, day, like the element, and then the temperature reading. Like that's, if I were to draw it out and sketch it out on a piece of paper, that's what I would do. If I first do that, I get the version of the data set on the left, right? And so, like, yeah, like the actual paper sort of cleaned it up a little bit extra. So it's like date is one date column instead of the components, but we can look over that part for now. We should end up with, after the pivot longer step, this version on the left. And so what is the other component of like variables being stored in rows and columns? The tidy form of this data, or really the um, way that you would want to store this data for like a database, or if you want to save this data set for later on for long-term storage, is this version of the data set on the right. How do we know that there's a problem with that data set? So this is really just a set of heuristics. There's no, it's not as strong of a rule where it's like, hey, if these columns follow a pattern, like pivot longer, right? So the function that we're going to be using is the opposite of pivot longer, which is pivot wider. But now we need to try to figure out like why or when do we use the pivot wider function? One of the hints that you need to use pivot wider is if you look at your data set and you see a lot of values being repeated. So it's really common that like you look across, um, you might end up with data sets where like, hey, there's a whole bunch of like demographic or identifier variables that are repeated. And they're repeated only because like this one value at the end is different. And it's because it's making a different calculation of something or a different observation of a calculation. So that's one hint, right? And so if that's what you identify, then using pivot wider, you specify the column you want to pivot out. So this is very similar to the pivot table function in Excel. You select the column, so element. So each unique value of the element column, which is going to be Tmax and Tmin, are going to be their own brand new columns. And then we have to specify, hey, when we do this pivoting process, we need another column that is the values that we'll use to fill in the new columns that got created. So we need to specify two columns for that pivot wider operation. And now we have fewer repeated identifiers. So if I look here, the first two values are going to be like this ID with January 30th. But January 30th for that ID only shows up once now. And so if you see a bunch of IDs being duplicated, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to use pivot wider, but it is something you might want to think about. And then in our example next, I'll show you another heuristic um, of when you would want to use pivot. So let's look up another data set. In this case, it's going to be the CMS data, which is the Center of Medicare Services in the United States. So these are people who are age 65 and above. And we can load up this data set. It's under data. It's under CMS underscore utilization. Spell this correctly. We'll be able to do that. So this is the CMS data set. We have for a given state in the United States, each state has a FIPS code. there is a column called variable. So we have different readings for per capita spending standardized, emergency department visits per 1,000 beneficiaries, hospital readmissions percentage, stuff like that. Then we have other demographics like sex, age group, number of chronic conditions, and then whatever that value column is, that reading. So it could be dollar amount, um, or average dollar amount, or percentage or count for a given set of years. So first thing, if I were to go and clean or think about cleaning this data set for someone else, again, this might be data in a format that's useful for other reasons, but we're talking about what does it look like to give someone a processed and cleaned data set. The first thing I'll notice is, hey, these columns look like it fits a pattern of sorts. That pattern looks like day of the year, a year column. So before knowing about any other common data problems, let's go fix that. So I'm going to run CMS. I'll call this long. We'll take this, sorry, it's going to equal CMS pivot underscore longer. And then we're going to select the columns that we want to pivot. So we're going to use backticks because it is the columns start with a number. We're going to use last call to select the last set of columns. And since we're at it, we might as well say names underscore 2 to be year. So it's a column that makes sense. And so now if I look at CMS long, we have state, FIPS code, variable, sex, age group, number of chronic, year, and value. And that looks a little cleaner, right? I can point to for each unique value of year, like I can calculate a average value, right? I can do that kind of group by aggregation. But there's another problem with this data set, and this is another hint to whether or not you need to do this type of data processing. If I just take the average of this value column, it won't make any sense. Why does it not make any sense? Well, this value here, 1639, represents a dollar amount for per capita spending. But if I scroll down a little bit, this value here is going to stand for standardized per capita spending. So it's still a dollar amount, which is, I guess, okay. But then down here, it's a count. It's visits per 1,000 beneficiaries. This is no longer a dollar amount. And then if I look down some more, there's another set of variables, which is hospital readmissions percentage. These numbers are just percentages. So I have a column that has really 4 different units. One is a dollar amount, a standardized dollar amount, a count, and then a percentage. So taking average for each unique value of state and year, giving the average value of that doesn't make sense, right? So that is your other hint that you might want to do another pivoting step. The benefit of this format is, well, I can always say group by variable, group by year, give me the average value, and I'll get those calculations. So you can add this somewhat problematic column into your grouping variable, but we're thinking about data for long-term storage and processing. And that's why this particular column we can't use right away, right? We can't just say, give me the average value of this column. It doesn't make sense because the units don't. And so that's, again, the heuristic. Hey, this variable column, we want to pivot wider. We're going to use this variable column. And then when it gets pivoted, we're going to use this value column as the set of values to populate. So what does that look like? We can take our CMS long data set, type it into a function called pivot underscore wider. And then we specify the 2 columns. So it's going to be names underscore from. What is the column that we're pivoting wider? It's going to be that column called variable. So this is sort of like a weird naming, but it's a column called variable that is telling us what type of calculation is being made. And then we say values from, and that is the value column with all of the weird numbers that we can't really take an average of. So if we run that and we save that to a variable, CMS tidy, we now have state, FIPS code, some gender, demographic stuff, year, and now we have a really clean way to look across. So that is that point in tidy data. Like each row should be an observation. So for a given year and state number of chronic conditions, like what were per capita spending, standardized, ED visits, hospital readmissions percentage, right? So much cleaner this way. I can give this to somebody else and they can do whatever they want, but I've roughly fixed up um, a lot of the common data problems that can happen. And maybe you end up using that separate function to break up things. At this point, um, you can combine all of those core components. All right, so we're going to do one more exercise before I conclude today's class. So there's um, this particular experiment or this particular exercise. So if you go to that link under experiment or EX3, match up your username, click on the link for EX3, and we will take 5 minutes to go over this exercise. And we'll have one more exercise to do after this. And then I'll do my conclusion and send everybody a whole bunch of links and where to find them. That'll all go out later this week. So we'll take a couple minutes to work on that exercise. And if you have any questions, just you can message in Zoom chat or you can direct message me, and I'll save up questions answered. All right, let's look at this last exercise. So this looks at the same Ebola problem that we did in the previous exercise, which was exercise 2. So that's the same starting point. And then the end point was how do we get from day to day, country, cases, and death? Right? And so it's very similar. That first process, which was Ebola, we're going to pass that into a function called pivot underscore longer. Um, we specify the columns that we want. So that is um, cases Guinea all the way to the last column. So I'm going to say cases Guinea all the way to last underscore call. We then put that into a function called separate. The column that we're going to separate after it gets pivoted is going to be called name. It's going to go into two new columns called, case underscore death, country, and then we can separate on the underscore. And then we do from this point of the data set, that is exactly the same state that we left off with in the previous example. So now we can say pivot underscore wider. And then the columns that we're going to specify. So it's going to be names from case underscore death. And then values from value. Right? And then so that should be that part of the data set. And then I really just to keep everything a little bit consistent, um, at least for this class, I'm going to say drop missing. So I have a nice data set where I have complete cases. So there might be cases where cases are provided, but deaths aren't, vice versa. Um, that's that's a different type of data cleaning decision. But for our case, we're going to drop so we have complete cases, and now we have a nice, tidy, clean data set that we can save to a database and give to other people. All right, so we're going to I'm going to talk a little bit more of a conclusion. We have one more exercise, and then I'll, at the very end, give out a whole bunch of links and then still give people a chance to um, give you the link if you want the um, recordings and all of that stuff. After. So today we talked about having data as a beginning of a pipeline. We have talked about that wrangling process. So that is the process that we talked about. And then once we have a data set that's really clean, then we can then point to columns for visualizations. Like, for example, I want, if you think about the Ebola column, maybe I want a line graph that is just the case counts over day, and then another line on top that is death counts over the same day, right? You can now think of that because you can point to columns. Same thing with modeling. Not really useful in the Ebola sense, but oh no, it is. So if we're thinking about time series models, we can say like, okay, our time component is that day variable, and then we have the values, which is counts or deaths or whatever one we care about, and then we can slowly create a model off of that. And that's only because we have data in tidy format that we can point to columns for. Versus that original point where it was case counts and death counts all together with the country, harder to create a more global model because we don't have the ability to point to a single column. Right? So even though that there are formats for data that are useful for you as a person because you want to quickly eyeball something, um, there are fundamental tools to make processing easier and let the computer do the hard work. Right? So the main takeaway is make friends with tidy data. Um, it will make your life much easier. Think about using like that separator, like leaving dashes or underscores or stuff like that. When you're curating your own data set, use those as breadcrumbs for you to later on when you're processing data, right? And I do that all the time when I'm writing together my own data set. So the last thing, one more exercise, um, and I'll take questions until the end of class. If we go back here, there is this last column called sum. If you can be so kind as to click on that and work through that exercise. That exercise has a couple of code components in it. So if you can, please copy paste all of those code components into the survey. So it's not just one small part, but do what you can. They're really like, as long as you submit something, I'll be happy. So it doesn't have to always be, don't think you have to 100% provide a correct solution. That's totally fine. So yeah, I will sort of like leave the timer for 13 minutes, and that'll be the last exercise. And then towards the end, as the final conclusion, I'll send out a whole bunch of links off of everything that we covered today. So we'll spend some time to work on this exercise. If you have any questions about it, let me know. And then I'll sign everyone off in about 12 minutes. So if you're still working, please keep working. I just want to go through some of the conclusion resources and all of that. If you haven't noticed already, the this is all part of a sort of project around data science materials for the biomedical sciences, and so that's why you see ds4biomed in a lot of the materials that are being used. If you want to know more about it, you can click on. I put them into the Zoom chat, but there is a sort of prose book that I'm still working on, but at least the tidy data up until past the tidy data chapter is pretty much well written, I think, and everything else towards the end is more teaching notes. So you can go there if you would like. Um, Links to the slide deck and the papers and everything, not just for this class, but for the full like 6 to 12 hour workshop. Um, that's also provided there as well. And if you want, I directly linked you straight to the Tidy Data chapter. So if you want to just read what we went over today, you can as well. And then there are additional links there at the bottom. So I will, if you are here, then you definitely have been getting my emails. So sometime later this week, I will send you an email with the code that I wrote in class. So you have that as a resource. Um, I will provide the solution for the final, for that last question that we worked on. That will be in the email as well. So you have that. I'll provide the solutions for all the other exercises um, in that email as well, since I think people have asked me for it. And then lastly, all of this is being recorded. And so that will all eventually go onto YouTube and you can have that as a reference and resource as well. Between, I don't know, sometime between now and the next couple of days, if you want to give out the sign up link to other people, you can. What I'm going to do is I'm going to send out the email, and whoever's on that list, they will get the email. So if you want other people to know about it because of the recordings, I'll send them the email to the recordings as well. So that'll all be provided in the next couple of days. So with that, I don't want to go over time. So I will conclude today's class. Thank everyone for coming. For those of you who uh, took the exercises and submitted them, I thank you very much. If you haven't, just a little backstory about the study, it's really trying to see how exercises work in a workshop context. And that also means that we have to think really hard about materials to cut to make room for exercises and stuff like that. So that is what the study actually is about. So we are at time. So with that, I'll say goodbye to everyone. You are in the United States. Have a happy US Thanksgiving. And I will hang around. If anyone has any questions, I'll just hang around until the last person leaves. So, but with that, you are free to go.